Hello, this is John Dunn, and this is my selfie video for my observation of Elizabeth Mendoza's high school sophomore level English class. For this, prompt 1, describe the assessment I observed. For this observation, I observed Elizabeth Mendoza teaching her sophomore level English course on Monday, November 14th, 2016, from 8:30 a.m. to 10:15 a.m. The course that day consisted of Mrs. Mendoza having her students read a short story titled One Summer Night by Ambrose Pierce. After reading the story, the students then discussed the story, determining what the story was about with two questions in mind. Was Henry Armstrong buried alive? And how/when did he die? Mrs. Mendoza then had a class discussion in regards to the two questions, seeing how well they answered. After the course of when discussing her tools of assessment, she confirmed that she uses these short stories to determine how well the students are able to recognize literary devices, complex vocabulary, and other higher level reading skills. There are drawbacks of open discussion as there is little tangible, concrete evidence to student growth compared to an assessment like a pop quiz. While this did not come up in discussion, she did state that she prefers open discussion because it helps students collaborate, as she feels it is an adequate diagnostic test. Much like what Overton says in Assessment in Special Education, an applied approach, diagnostic tests may be used to measure mastery of specific skills, strengths, and weaknesses whenever the educator wishes to monitor student progress. Mrs. Mendoza indeed uses these short story discussions at the beginning of new units to measure how the students' mastery of literature and reading, how well they are able to understand complex works of writing, and determine weaknesses in vocabulary or understanding themes and ideas. Mrs. Mendoza then has the students peer edit each other's short stories that they had been assigned earlier in the semester. She stated that this allows groups to give feedback on what they have learned in regards to sentence structure, putting together ideas, and encouraging them to judge the performance of their peers. Following a 5-minute break, Mrs. Mendoza gave a rubric she referred to as a check sheet. As Kathy Hall states, if one knows the criteria against one's work is judged, then one is clearly better placed to produce a good piece of work. This is indeed important, as others, if Miss Mendoza just assigned her courses to read the book of Frankenstein without showing her intentions of what the students should be trying to learn, it is unlikely they would be able to learn the key ideas through effort alone. Assigning this rubric then shows the students the criteria that their work would be judged. This also indicated for the students the start of a new unit that would end with a final project that carries over into the next semester. The second prompt asks, align the assessment you observe with the type of assessments you have read about this week. With this observation, I feel that of the types of assessment that I've learned about this week, Mrs. Mendoza's course mostly aligns with diagnostic assessment, both formative and summative. I felt there was little evidence pointing towards any sort towards of screening instruments or dynamic assessment being used. As Dame Mary Clay defines dynamic assessment as an interactive form of assessment. For example, if a child is given a pretest or a before measure in an intervention, then giving a post-test to determine if the student is responding to the intervention. The reason being, at least evidenced in this course, that the tools used to assess did not involve any pre or post testing in favor of more formative assessments. An example of formative assessments would be Mrs. Mendoza having the class engage in open discussion after the reading the short story. As stated by Kathy Hall in Purposes, Approaches, and Intentions in Assessments, Policy, and Practice, assessment is formative when learners use information from assessment to bridge the gap between what they can do and what they need to be able to do. The short story introduces the literary idea, what it means to be human, which is instilled by Mrs. Mendoza, having the students examine the story to determine whether or not Henry Armstrong is alive or dead. This serves as an introduction to the study of the story of Frankenstein and the literary idea of what does it mean to be human. This also engages the practice of formative assessment by allowing time for individuals or groups to feedback on what they have learned as one of Hall's listed practices of assessment. After that assignment, Mrs. Mendoza, assigning the students together randomly, peer edit their own short stories from an assessment in progress, which takes the form of peer assessment, where students judge performance and explain their reasoning. Lastly, assigning the key project for the end of the semester demonstrates the use of summative reasoning, given that it is designed to be a cumulative project at the end of each unit, which are then able to be used for determining the overall subject level, as further stated by Dame Marie Clay. In the third prompt, it asks, do I agree with the educator's assessment strategies? During my observation, I thought Mrs. Mendoza was a superb educator. Hall defines assessing learning as collecting information on evidence on learners and making judgments about it, which I find Mrs. Mendoza integrates in her classroom incredibly well. A great majority of her course this day demonstrated her use of assessment through engaging tasks to ensure her students are following along at their education level, which is incredibly important due to the nature of her class, as she has stated that it was an honors sophomore level. Students age ranged only from 12 to 15, indicating some of these students were very advanced. Due to these circumstances, I agree with a lot of Mrs. Mendoza's assessment strategies. The use of formative assessment with peer editing each other's writings and discussing information learned amongst themselves while sharing the learning intentions with class at the start of the assignment are great examples that could be observed. As well as assigning a final project with cumulative checkpoints demonstrates a more solidified summative assessment. I feel this is preferential to another form of summative assessment, such as a final exam or final paper. It is also a great course of action as it allows students to work individually or in groups. It is also effective as she can observe students' progress through documented journal entries during the course of the project. Included also with the check sheet, she states learning intentions to the class at the start of the unit to give the students direction of what should be learned, in this case, what it means to be human. This is notable as Hall states, if one knows the criteria against one's work is judged, then one is clearly better placed to produce a good piece of work. In the final prompt, we discussed another strategy I would suggest as an alternative or an addition to what the educator is currently implementing. There isn't much I would alternate for Mrs. Mendoza's use of assessment tools, as hers use is fairly comprehensive. If I were to add any assessment to her repertoire, it would be a few things. In her use of formative assessment with the reading of one sermon night, while the open discussion provides valuable feedback on how a student has learned in that assignment, I feel having the student answer the questions given at the beginning of the assignment in their personal journals or having the student write down and submit their answers can provide more concrete evidence of a learner's apprehension of the subject matter, allowing us to assess their educational level. Another alteration I would include would have to be the discussion after the short story transpire as more of a Socratic seminar. In Mrs. Mendoza's discussion, she had the students raise their hands when she asked the provided questions, which I feel having it as more of an open discussion would allow more peer discussion instead of just having the students singularly answer her questions. Overall, it was great to observe Mrs. Mendoza's class that morning, especially as I would like to eventually be in that field of teaching literature at a high school level.